turning in?
I tried to do it in this class, and you just got to set up on it, but it hasn't entered in silent, so it won't proceed. I sent him an email. I hadn't heard back from him. I guess I could ask him again.
Okay. Because I was thinking about turning in mine tonight.
What is this?
After I review
Turn
my
it in sight.
bid.
I'll just ask him when he pops up on the screen here.
Who, Brad?
I'll give you your Turnitin stuff this week sometime.
What?
You heard us. Here,
Oh.
We're just anxious to turn in our stuff to you.
You act like you travel.
Hey,
all the
that's
time,
great.
Brad.
Do what now?
Did you act like you travel all the time or something?
No, I don't.
Hey, congratulations on the fake magazine.
Oh yeah, congratulations. Pretty cool.
Hey, y'all, seriously, keep that in your prayers. That's we don't have a clue. All I know is we got orders for a couple of thousand, and we know they're going into all the Barnes and Nobles and all the book worlds, and that's exciting.
A lot.
So keep it in your prayers.
Heard anything from
All
Borders?
right, are we? Actually, she said that there's a strong possibility we'll be in Borders within 2 months.
Nice.
All the Borders. So you want to know? Hey, Dean, you want to know what my next goal is? I'm one of these people. I set goals and try to usually set them high. Guess where I want next?
Europe.
No, I want Walmart.
Walmart?
There you go.
I want Think to be a Walmart.
Sounds good.
Because think about it. I mean, how many Walmarts are out there?
Everywhere. Hold up to New York City.
There's two just on the street I live on.
Are you guys seeing a single slide or 2 slides?
Single.
Okay, good. All right. So we left off by me asking you the question, why did the editors put this on there? Long story short, guys, it's because they're trying to appease anybody that would hold to any type of biblical image of God kind of stuff. But I want you to look with me at what Charles Darwin actually did say. The editors there said Charles Darwin never claimed that we are. Here's what Darwin says. There can hardly be a doubt that man is the offshoot of the old world simian stem. That would be monkeys, by the way. Under a genealogical point of view, he must be classified with the catarrhine, the old world monkeys. He further stated, we have seen that man appears to have diverged from the catarrhine of the old world division of Simidae, monkeys, and apes, after these diverged from the new world division. So Charles Darwin most definitely believed that we evolved from some ape-like creature. Why in the world do I, as a scientist, why do I have a problem with it? Why don't I just go along with what everybody's teaching? Why don't I just bow my head and act like a sheep and do what everybody else does? Guys, the main reason is because the evidence that they've got is miserable evidence. And I mean that with every fiber of my being. Let's go right here. Can you guys see me as well as the screen or just the computer? Okay. When I kick off the screen, I'll show you. I brought in some textbooks basically to just show you that what we're talking about right now is definitely in the textbooks. We're going to start with some of these evolutionary hoaxes. Some of these you guys have seen, some of them you probably haven't seen. I don't necessarily want you to memorize all of these, but I do want you to be familiar enough with them. Number one, because the people who you preach to, the teens, the college, the high school class, they are definitely going to be familiar with these. But number two, because this is strong ammunition against one of the most godless theories that's out there. All right, we'll start with this one. You got 2 moths on this tree. The story that they are telling, now hopefully, do you guys just see a single slide or do you see the whole deal here? Okay. The story that they're telling young people is this, that prior to the Industrial Age, there was 95% of the light-colored moths, 5% of the dark. They call these peppered moths, and guys, these are in just about every textbook that I've got in my office. They then say the Industrial Age happened, soot came down from the factories, it settled onto the trees, and if you look at the picture beside it, you'll notice the tree is much darker. And they say the population shifted to where you got 95% dark, 5% light. They call this evolution in action. And in fact, if you go to a museum like, for instance, the Museum of Natural History in London, you see displays of this in support of the evolutionary theory. The only problem with this, guys, is the moths do not rest on tree trunks. And you say, wait a second, Brad, you just showed us pictures of moths resting on tree trunks. Yeah, those are either glued or pinned. They're dead. And they've either been glued or pinned to the tree. Notice number 2. The moths don't have a tendency to choose matching backgrounds. In fact, I would back up and point out on the first one, only 2 moths have been seen on tree trunks in more than 40 years of research. So, you know, what they're painting, the picture they're painting, is total garbage to young people. The third point here, Catawell's results have not been replicated in later studies. What do we call that?
Fail.
We call that garbage in science. If you can't reproduce somebody's findings, then that means the original work was probably garbage. But here's what I want you to see. Now, we know that they're staging these pictures. We know this is bad research. So why do they keep putting it into textbooks? Listen to what one of the textbook writers said. So the guy named Bob Ritter, he said, you have to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for a first-time learner? He said, the advantage of this example of natural selection is that it's extremely visual. We want to get across the idea of selective adaptation. Later on, they, talking about high school students, can look at the work critically. In other words, later on, they can discern if it's true or not. But right now, I'm going to go ahead and teach it and include it in textbooks because it sells the idea that we want to sell. Guys, that's why I call these hoaxes or evolutionary icons. It's garbage. How about this one? These are embryos that are still to this day featured in almost every single biology textbook. The way that you read these, if you look at the lower left-hand corner, I'm going to go across the bottom. You've got, for instance, you've got a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a couple of mammals, and finally a human. At 3 different stages of development. So this is, the top row is very early on, the second row is a few weeks later, the third row is a few weeks after that. The point being, if you look across that top row, what does everything look like? For the most part, it looks pretty similar, doesn't it? It looks almost the same. The guy who drew these, he believed in evolution. And he believed that we all had a common ancestor and we all went through the same evolutionary stages of development in the womb. The guy's name was Ernst Haeckel. Ironically, he said the turning point in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species. In fact, those of you who know your history, you know that this man actually visited Charles Darwin at his home on the Mount when Charles Darwin was sick. Now, do we still put them in textbooks? Absolutely. Now, we've colorized them. We made them prettier. But it's selling the exact same idea. So in this one, for instance, you've got a fish a turtle, a chicken, a rabbit, and a human. Notice what it says right here. Early in development, all vertebrate embryos are remarkably similar. Yeah, Dean?
In Jonathan Wells' Icons of Evolution,
Yes.
doesn't he say something about how they didn't start, the drawings even at the very beginning of what they say here is the beginning, is actually like 2 or 3 stages down?
Absolutely, yeah. Very much so. Guys, here's the big deal. Ernst Haeckel lied in his pictures. If you look at the top row, that's what he drew. And he purposefully lied. He even finally admitted it. He was convicted of fraud. He was kicked out of the University of Jena. On the bottom row, that's the actual embryos. But here's the point. We've known now for 100 years, almost 150 years, that this guy lied with his pictures. And yet, as I pointed out, this is a textbook from 1998, and I could certainly use one from 2008, where we're still using these embryos, even though this guy lied. Here's a quote from an evolutionist, a guy by the name of Stephen Jay Gould. He wrote in Natural History magazine several years back an article titled Atrocious, where he specifically talked about Ernst Haeckel drawing these distortions, as he puts it. Notice the subtitle, Haeckel's Distortions Did Not Help Darwin. Look at what he says. We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered the 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not majority, of modern textbooks. You've got an evolutionist here who's saying that this is a century, 100 years of mindless recycling. That's pretty telling right there. All right, icon number 3. This is what Dean mentioned earlier. Most of us have seen these pictures where you've got this alleged early little bitty creature that they say gave rise to all modern day horses. Now let's stop for just a moment, use a little bit of common sense and think about something. If this were true, would it not be true that all animals should be evolving bigger like that? I mean, think about it. Why don't we have a 1-ton mouse creature? I mean, seriously. Their whole proposition is you started with this little guy and he evolved up bigger. And so what do? They put it in textbooks. And they brainwash kids that evolution is true. But the fact of the matter is, guys, the evidence doesn't support what they've got. Here's why they say it. Let me back up for just a minute. If you look at the picture on the screen, at the bottom lower left, the creature called Eohippus, they have found fossilized bones of this guy's foot. And as you can tell, they're very, very different from a modern-day horse's foot. And what they have basically done in their mind is they've said, oh, this must be the progenitor of modern-day horses. They've drawn this evolutionary tree. But let me ask you the question, is it possible that this was simply a creature that God created and that his foot was created just like it was in the picture there, excuse me, and that there was no evolution taking place? Now, I wouldn't say it happened 54 million years ago, but let's look at what the evidence really shows. For instance, an evolutionist by the name of Harrub Nielsen, look at what he says. The family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in the textbooks. In the reality provided by the results of research, it is put together from 3 parts, of which only the last can be described as including horses. The forms of the first part are just as much little horses as present-day daemons or horses. The construction of the horse is therefore a very artificial one, since it is put together from non-equivalent parts and cannot therefore be a continuous transformation series. Guys, we've known that now for over 50 years, and yet we keep putting it in textbooks. George Gaylord Simpson said, "The uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature." So again, we find some fossils. Evolutionists decide that maybe that's the early ancestor of a horse. They make these wonderful pictures, and they brainwash generations of young people. Next one is vestigial organs. Somebody tell me, what is a vestigial organ?
It's kind of the leftover of something that was previously used but not necessary now.
Exactly. They would call it evolutionary baggage. And the common examples that they would give would be things like your tonsils, your appendix, your maybe your thymus. If you look in this textbook, notice what it says. Vestigial structures are remnants of an organism's evolutionary past. In fact, they go on then to give several examples. But I want you to notice, though, all the way back in 1931, which is not that long ago, they listed human beings that have 180 vestigial organs in our bodies. 180. Today, that list is pretty much all gone because we know what stuff does. Now, that kind of tells you what our knowledge has done in the last 70 years. But I want you to look with me for just a moment at the progression in textbooks. 1989, they are still teaching, you'll notice at the bottom of this particular page, vestigial structures can be viewed as evidence for evolution. And they talk about things like the human tailbone, the pelvic bone, the appendix. We then go to 1994. And we got a picture of a human appendix with a horse appendix. And you notice that the human appendix looks shriveled up. It looks like a worm. And their thought is, hey, we don't need it, so it is basically evolving away. It's going away. It is thought to be, quote, vestigial. That's 1994. Growier's Encyclopedia, 1998. Long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. Its removal also increases a person's susceptibility to leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, cancer of the colon, and cancer of the ovaries. In other words, we now know the appendix has an immune function. And yet all this time, they thought that it was just a vestigial organ. It's kind of like the tonsils. Back when I was little, if you had strep throat for 3 or 4 times in a row, they automatically would cut your tonsils out. Well, they're not as quick to do that anymore today, because they know that the tonsils are a great primary source for a first line of immune defense. This is a quote from R.L. Weisshorn. By the way, if you are interested in Christian evidences, this would be a very, very, very good book to add to your library. It used to be kind of the classic. It's called The Evolution Creation Controversy, put out by Inquiry Press. Here's what he said. Not too long ago, man was imputed to have 180 vestiges. Organs like the appendix, the tonsils, the thymus, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, they were all on the list. Today, all former vestigial organs are known to have some function during the life of the individual. If an organ has any function at any time, it cannot be called rudimentary or vestigial. As man's knowledge has increased, the list of vestigial organs has decreased. So what really was vestigial? Was it not man's rudimentary knowledge of the intricacies of the body? Guys, I love that quote because basically what he's saying is, the only thing vestigial around here was our stupidity. Basically, as time has progressed, we've learned what all this stuff does. So anytime somebody comes up to me and says, well, we got vestigial organs, I basically laugh. Number one, because we don't. Number two, because it's like, dude, if you honestly think that they're vestigial, maybe you ought to give yourself some time so you won't look like an idiot later on and realize that it actually has a function. Comments, thoughts so far?
You ask him to cut them all out if you want them.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Let's look at another evolutionary hoax. How about the geologic column? You guys probably remember studying a column where each one of the layers was given a name. See if some of these don't sound familiar. You've got the Cambrian period, the Carboniferous period, the Jurassic period, the Triassic period, the Cretaceous period. According to evolutionists, each one of those was laid down over millions of years. Dean, tell me one problem with that.
Well, one problem that they have in explaining in the column is the Cambrian Explosion, I believe, in which you have animals that appear in the fossil records you have animals that really don't have a fossil record, much less ancestors.
Right, absolutely. Not only do they come on the fossil scene very quickly, very complex, you also have males and females already there. Boom. No transitions. Okay, guys, look at that column for just a moment. Let me back up a slide. So you got all these different kind of rocks. You got different kinds of layers. There you go. I show a picture of the Grand Canyon with all the different color layers. Do you not think it's a little bit ironic that this theory requires you to add new sediment on top of where you are today? You understand what I'm talking about? All of these other layers are buried deep in the earth. You got the Cambrian Explosion, the Jurassic Age, the what? Guys, where did the new dirt and rocks come from? Because think about it. I don't wake up every morning to see a few inches or centimeters of dirt around my feet slowly covering me up. It's not like every year we add just a little bit more layer to what the period that we're in. It's the most ludicrous thing in the world, and yet nobody ever points out the fact that this requires the addition of created material. In other words, if you look at this for just a moment, you've got the Carboniferous period right here. Where did all the material to cover up the creatures in the Carboniferous period come from? It's nuts.
Hey, Brad?
Yes.
Couldn't they say that it was covered up through natural disasters such as volcanoes or local floods or things like that? Couldn't that be a reasonable explanation in their mind?
They could, Dean, but then you would have a jumbled column. We're talking about a very neat, let me back up, a very neat, well laid down striatal layers that you can see. I mean, you guys have driven up and down the interstate. You've seen the different layers. Are we really to believe that each one of those layers was put there 1 million years ago and then the next one fell on top of it? Well, where did the stuff come from that fell on top of it? It's foolishness. I mean, Dean, I understand what you're saying. Maybe there was a volcano and it came up. Well, if that's the case, it wouldn't be a nice, neat layer. Now, let me pick on somebody. James.
Pick on me anyway, so I'll raise my hand.
James, what would happen if we've got a fossilized tree in the fossil record that starts right here in the Carboniferous period? But it's so tall that it actually extends up into the Cretaceous period. So it's fossilized from Carboniferous all the way up here to the Cretaceous. What would that do?
That would, that's a polystrate fossil, and that debunks the idea that every one of those layers were placed there after thousands or millions of years.
Yeah, if you look over here on the side of this picture, this time scale is in millions of years. So you got 200 million, you got 150 million, 100 million years ago, 50 million years ago, etc. So my question to him is, if we had a tree that died 250 million years ago in the Carboniferous period, and it stretched all the way up into the Cretaceous period, that tree would be spanning a distance of 150 million years. Here's the point. Number one, that should never happen. Because if you've got a dead tree, it's going to decay and rot. But we do have those fossils, and I'll show them to you in just a minute. Only place where you're going to find this particular geologic column is in the textbooks. Period. Somebody tell me, what is circular reasoning?
Basically, dating one thing and then finding something in that, well, in their case, in that same layer, and dating it cross-referencing the other thing that you found.
Absolutely. So the most common would be, let's say we find a dinosaur bone or a flying reptile fossil. They look at that and they say, well, dinosaurs existed 65 million years ago, so this layer must be 65 million years old. Therefore, if they find any more bones in that, any more fossils, guess what they automatically get labeled as? 65 million years. So we're dating the layer according to the bones we find in it, and then we turn right around and we date the other bones in it according to the layer that they're in. It's circular reasoning. Some of you have heard of me talking about an experiment that was done in Spirit Lake. I'll fly through this. Creationist by the name of Dr. Steve Austin he's actually still recording how fast Mount St. Helens is coming back. One of the things that he found, though, in Spirit Lake, right beside Mount St. Helens, was that the trees were getting water saturated, and then they would actually sink uprightly in the bottom of Spirit Lake. And that the sediment is actually filtering out according to weight. So the heavier particles have already settled to the bottom down here, and then you've got the lighter particles that are coming in. He said it looks like a forest in that particular lake. But the point is, what he's seeing is what we see in the fossil record. So this is a rock bluff. Just to give you a perspective, there are 3 men at the bottom of it. Here's one. You see the men at the bottom? Those are 5 fossilized trees. But Jerry, what I want you to notice is not that it's just 5 fossilized trees. Look at how many different layers they're going through. How do you have a tree that starts way down here in the Carboniferous layer and it extends all the way up through the Cretaceous layer that's supposedly 150 million years later? Guys, that tree would decay and rot. And yet we've got these fossils. This one is taken in Nova Scotia. This one's actually taken in, I think this one's in Texas. This picture says, in Germany, France, British Isles, Nova Scotia, California, several eastern states, fossils that extend through several layers of sedimentary rock have been found. These are called polystrate fossils. Usually they're tree trunks. There actually is a a fish, a baleen whale that has been fossilized that goes through several different layers. But the point is, these things really do put a crimp in the whole idea of a geologic column. Question, comment so far?
Brad, can you go back over the circular reasoning? I'm not sure if I'm following that.
Okay. All right, Dean, let's say that you go out for a morning jog, and you go down around the maybe like Keystone Ski area. And while you're running around out there, lo and behold, you're kicking dirt around, and you come across a femur of a dinosaur.
Okay.
You make a really stupid mistake, and instead of calling me, you call an evolutionist. And they come out there and they tell you, wow, that animal lived 65 million years ago.
Okay.
So they look at the rock type that bone is in, and they say, hey, this is shale or limestone or sandstone or whatever, and they automatically label that layer that bone was found in as 65 million years old. Because according to them, that's when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. Now, any other fossils that you dig out of there, whether it be a flying reptile, whether it be a little mouse-like creature, they're going to say, because it was in that same layer, it must be 65 million years old. In other words, that layer got labeled 65 million years because of the one bone you found. But then they turn around and date the rest of the bones according to the layer that it's in. Do you understand the circular reasoning?
I'm still not tracking.
Okay. Let me see.
I don't understand why, if the bone was found in the layer that's 65 million years old, why it's circular reasoning to label everything else that's labeled in that layer, that same.
Because the bone really isn't 65 million. They simply made that observation because they think dinosaurs lived that far back. So they misdated the layer to begin with. They made an assumption on that dinosaur bone. So, like for instance, if I assumed woolly mammoths lived 500,000 years ago,
Yeah.
and I find a woolly mammoth bone,
Mm-hmm.
the layer dirt that it's found in, what would I assume that dirt, how old that dirt is?
500,000.
There you go. So I've now made an assumption of the dirt age. Any other bones in that dirt age would then be assumed to be how old?
500,000.
Right. Do I have any clue that the dirt is actually 500,000?
No.
No, because I based my reasoning on the assumption that woolly mammoths roamed 500,000 years ago, and that anything found in that layer would be the same age as the dirt.
Well then, I guess my question would be, how would you find out the actual age of that bone?
How would I find it out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously scientists are saying, okay, any bone that we find that's of a dinosaur, it's got to be at least 65 million years. Well, if that's not the case, how do you prove that the bone isn't 65 million years?
Number one, understand that we're using the same exact fossils. Our difference is the interpretation of it.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got the same data.
Yep.
Number two, I would say, okay, let's throw out all of our evolutionary presuppositions. And let's look at what this thing can tell us, and let's be honest about what it cannot tell us. Can this bone tell us, for instance, what the color of skin the dinosaur had on it? No. Can it tell us how fat it was? No. Can it tell us how intelligent it was? No. can it maybe shed a little bit of light on what it ate, depending on how good the bone is preserved, maybe. Can it tell us the fact that it was here and that it's dead? Absolutely. But for me to go much beyond that, I'm now starting to make some strong assumptions. I would then maybe look at some of the other creatures in the same area, the same region, and I would say, hey, you know what? They got a mouse in this same layer. We've got mice today. They've got a very similar structure. Is it reasonable to assume that mouse was very closely related to modern mice, and therefore that dinosaur bone is not zillions of years old? Absolutely.
Well,
but what they do is they find a mouse and they say, hey, this is an evolutionary mouse. This is the ancestor of all the mice. This mouse must have been 65 million years old. And they give it a whole new name.
Well, I see what you're saying, and I guess my only question would be, is the same way that he comes at the fossil from an evolutionary standpoint, you're coming at it from a creationist standpoint, and so while he assumes 65 million, ultimately, aren't you assuming that it's less than 10,000?
Except that, Dean, I would be very upfront and honest to say you can't get age from fossils. There's a lot that fossils do not tell us.
So you can't get age from any fossil?
No. How do you do that? The only possible way that you would even consider would be their techniques of radiometric or radiocarbon dating, which already are built on so many bad assumptions and are built in to give you ancient ages.
And so you can't assume that off of layer either because nobody knows how old dirt is?
No, you want to know why?
Because of natural...
Let me give you a modern day example of why this is garbage. Let's say that you are out digging and you come across a tent that is octagonal, that has wooden supports in it, that has, for instance, maybe some cotton fibers where the people slept on it, and you dig more and you find like a fire pit, and you dig around more and you find some animal skins. What are you assuming?
They were all together?
No, I mean, as far as that particular find, what do you assume about it? The people who live there, what?
Or primitive?
Okay. Now, keep the tent in your mind for just a moment, Dean. And let's say you go 50 miles away and you dig up a 7-story skyscraper that is fully wired with fiber optics, that has water fountains, bathrooms on every floor. It has glass reflective windows.
Okay.
What assumption do you make about that particular discovery?
That it's modern.
Okay. Do you realize that you could find both of those structures being 50 miles away in areas such as Africa, where you still have people who are living today in a modern tent, and then you have metropolitan cities of Africa where they have 7 or 8-story buildings? The point is, the discoveries tell you nothing about time. You just made the assumption in your mind that one was primitive and one was modern. That's garbage. So just because you dig up a tent doesn't mean it was years and years and years ago. There are people in Africa living in those tents today, especially the octagonal one that I described. You drive 15 miles away and you're in a city where they've got a building. So just because you came across 2 different forms of living, that tells you nothing about time. All the assumptions that you made were assumptions in your mind. Yes, no, maybe?
I'm tracking like a tank.
All right, while he is tracking, as we say in the South, bless his heart, let's keep going.
Wow. I never knew that.
How about, let me scoot on down. Hold on just 1 second. All right, let's do this one. Another evolutionary icon. Archaeopteryx. Is that what we're seeing on the screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Archaeopteryx was allegedly the link between dinosaurs and birds. And again, this one is in just about every single textbook. The reason being, about 10, 15 years ago, it became very apparent that evolution did not have an answer for birds. How do you evolve a bird? What does it evolve from? So they take a look at the bird's feet. They say, hey, that looks scaly. Maybe they came from dinosaurs. They make this alleged discovery, and this thing right here becomes a missing link. In fact, if you go to the St. Louis Zoo, what you're going to find is a shrine to Charles Darwin in an area that's called the Living World. And part of their evidence supporting evolution is this creature, this Archaeopteryx fossil. So there you see one of the original fossils. A couple of things I want you to notice about it. Number one, it does have a long, bony tail. Number two, it has got bony teeth, something that modern-day birds do not have. So they extrapolate from this and they say, hey, this guy's got a bony tail like a dinosaur. He's got teeth like a dinosaur. He must have been in the dinosaur family. And all of a sudden, voila, their problem of explaining flight, they think, is solved by this fossil. Well, that's total garbage, too. Because think about it for just a moment. Even if this was a link, evolutionists have still got to describe how insects came to fly, how mammals evolved flight, that is, bats. How did reptiles evolve flight, that is, flying reptiles? You got birds. If you want to be funny, you can throw in aquatic fish that are flying fish. You got all these different animals that fly. Not only do they fly, tell me something about the difference between a bumblebee, a housefly, and a dragonfly. Do they fly the same?
No.
Or what about an eagle and a hummingbird? Is their flight mechanism the same?
No.
Absolutely not. So they're left with this. Not only do they have to explain how there's something evolved flight, you got flight in just about every species or every animal family. Somebody tell me, what are the two theories of how flight came into existence?
I have no idea. The right.
There's only two.
And
Good try. You got ground up theory and a tree down theory. Ground up theory says this. There was some creature that had a lot of skin, kind of like maybe a squirrel, i.e. flying squirrel, and he was being chased, and lo and behold, he's running around one day, and he basically realizes that he can glide. He can stretch out his skin and glide away from a predator. The tree down theory is basically the same thing. You've got a creature that's in a tree. Maybe something's chasing him. Maybe he needs to get down quickly. He stretches out his skin. He realizes that he can glide down to the bottom. The point is, both of them are utterly ridiculous. Because if I were to ask Jerry or Paul to go out and run as fast as they can and keep stretching out their arms and their legs, How long is it going to take? How many years will it take them before they get off the ground?
Are you willing to find out?
You did pick the two old birds in the class. Oh, my.
The old birds. I like that. That's,
Yeah. Sorry.
new research shows. This is as of 1997. Jonathan Serafati. New research shows that birds lack the embryonic thumb that dinosaurs had, suggesting that it's almost impossible for the species to be closely related. So already, by 97, we know, anatomically speaking, birds and dinosaurs, they're not physiologically similar. You add to that the fact that one of them has got scales. One of them's got feathers. Are those at all alike?
Nope.
And, you know, I say this joke when I speak at seminars, you know, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it is serious. Nobody out there has ever seen a skeather. That is a mixture of a scale or feather.
I like Schwinger.
Colin Patterson, the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, he said Archaeopteryx has simply become a patsy for wishful thinking. Is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? He says perhaps yes, perhaps no. There's no way of answering the question. He said it's easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not a part of science, for there is no way of putting them to the test. Alan Fiducia, probably one of the world's foremost bird specialists, he said, I conclude that Archaeopteryx was arboreal, volant, considerably advanced aerodynamically, probably capable of flapping powered flight to at least some degree. He said Archaeopteryx was, in the modern sense, a bird. In fact, I actually emailed Alan October of 2006 because there was some papers that came out on this creature, and I wanted to make sure that when I went out to speak that I was not misrepresenting him. Now, obviously, this is the condensed version. He said, I send you warm greetings from, or I wrote him, I said, I send you warm greetings from Nashville. Are you now the position that Archaeopteryx was not a bird? He wrote back, he said, Archaeopteryx was clearly a well-developed bird with true feathers. He went on to comment to say, it will never be anything more than just a bird. Now, guys, don't let that pass you by. The world's foremost bird specialist recognizes this is not a transition or a missing link. It is simply just a bird. And that's all it'll ever be. Ironically, 5 years earlier, National Geographic tried something very similar. If you guys get National Geographic in the library there, let me encourage each one of you to at least look over the November 1999 issue. Inside that magazine, you're going to find an article titled Feathers for T-Rex. Notice what the subtitle of this article is. New bird-like fossils are missing links in dinosaur evolution. They don't leave a whole lot of, room for question. They're saying this is it right here. And it's in that particular article that they introduce what they consider to be another missing link, the Archaeoraptor. There you see an image of Archaeoraptor's fossils. The only problem is, guys, Archaeoraptor actually evolved in a Chinese farmhouse where some very entrepreneurial Chinese farmers, they glued the front half of a bird and the back half of a dinosaur together. They sold it to some unsuspecting American researchers who then published it in National Geographic and called it a missing link. Here's the interesting part, guys. Had they not used an MRI, they wouldn't know, till this day, they still wouldn't know that these were two different stones. It was that well glued together. Now, as you think about that, think about how many other alleged missing links have been sold as, hey, look at this, and yet the reality of it is it's garbage. Because how much do you guys think a Chinese farmer makes in a year?
Not much.
I can tell you, I worked with a couple Chinese neurosurgeons. An average farmer's income as of the year 2005 was about $200 a year. Now, if you can sell a fossil for $10,000 or $20,000, but you maybe have to doctor it up a little bit and make it prettier. Guys, that would basically be like me telling you, hey, I'll give you $5 million for that rock in your backyard. Deal. All right, next one. What about natural selection? Somebody tell me what is natural selection?
Certain traits in an animal or plant allow it to survive.
Okay.
And if the other animal or plant doesn't have it, then they don't survive, more or less.
Okay, so we often use the phrase what? Survival?
Survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest. What most of you probably don't know is that natural selection was actually first introduced by creationists. A guy by the name of Edward Blythe. And I don't have a problem with natural selection. In fact, I think that's probably God's way of weeding out the unfit animals. But I do have a problem with somebody saying that natural selection is a mechanism that explains all the animals around us today. Let me show you what I mean by that. Dutch botanist Hugo de Vries, look at how he phrased this, guys. He said, natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. Respected biologist Soren Lothrop, he said, micromutations do occur, but the theory that these alone can account for evolutionary change is either falsified or else it's an unfalsifiable, hence metaphysical theory. I suppose that nobody will deny that it's a great misfortune if an entire branch of science becomes addicted to a false theory. But this is what has happened in biology. I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. When this happens, many people will pose the question, how did this ever happen? So, do I think natural selection is the mechanism that drives evolution? Absolutely not. Do I think it is a mechanism that allows for stronger animals to survive? Absolutely. Now, a lot of people would call this... Say that again?
Just look what Darwin did to Wallace. Definitely.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah. Some people would call this a tautology, spelled Tautolgy. What is a tautology? Why are they calling it that? Think about survival of the fittest. If I were to ask you, which ones were fit? You tell me the ones that survived. All right? Which ones survived? The ones that are the fittest. In other words, that's a tautology. It's basically, you're not saying anything other than you're feeding yourself. Hey, the fit survive. Well, that's good. Which ones are fit? Oh, the ones that survive. Which ones survive? Oh, that would be the fittest. But you don't tell me anything about it. Comments, questions so far? You guys understand what happens when, what I'm doing is I'm giving you a very broad overview of some of these, what I call evolutionary hoaxes or icons. I want you to imagine a young person who has a chapter on evolution who gets this stuff, but they never, ever hear the truth of it. Like, they read about vestigial organs, and they read about these embryos being support, and they read about these peppered moths, and they read about Archaeopteryx, but they never ever get shown the fact of the matter being that, hey, this is garbage. We've disproved this stuff. This is not really a missing link. It's bunk. One more.
Hey, Brad, before we go, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is it true out of the science textbooks that you've seen or looked at, is it true that they don't mention the Cambrian Explosion a lot because of the problems it poses?
That's a great question.
'Cause I've heard stories of it just only being mentioned like in one sentence in a science book. I just want to know if that's true or not.
Well, let's do this. Let's look. This is a 2008 edition of Earth Science. It is the brand new one that is being put out by Glencoe and National Geographic. And if I were to turn to the index and look up Cambrian, is not even in here.
The Cambrian Explosion isn't even in there?
It's not in the index at all. No, but I know this will surprise you, but the word evolution is in here quite a bit. You got evolution of mammals, you got organic evolution, evolution of the stars, etc. So as of 2008, they don't even have that listed. It's not in this one.
Wow.
Now, it is in this one. This one's a little bit older, but it's not mentioned much. Why do you think they took it out?
Because it just
They got an agenda.
destroys their theory.
Absolutely. Guys, don't be surprised. Yeah, this one's got Cambrian period. Don't be surprised because, after all, they have now replaced a scientific law with a theory in textbooks. And by that I mean, scientific laws, you don't get to be a scientific law just by chance. If it is a scientific law, that means there are no exceptions. It has been exceptionally tested. It is always the case. There's a law known as the law of Abiogenesis that says life comes only from other life. That's now been replaced out of textbooks. They don't even put it in here, scientific law. It has been replaced with what's called abiogenesis, which is the theory that maybe through some kind of a mutative change that we could have had self-replicating units and generated life. So in other words, we're taking out a law and we're replacing it with bunk. One more and then I'll let you guys get out of there. What about viruses and bacteria? All of you guys have probably heard about what we call antibiotic resistant or multi-resistant strains of bacteria. If you work in a hospital, for instance, you will hear the phrase, depending on which hospital you work at, some of the doctors and nurses use the phrase MRSA or MRSA, multi-resistant staph aureus. Goes by a lot of different terms, but the point being that this is a bacteria that is no longer susceptible to the general spectrum of antibiotics. In this particular issue of National Geographic that's on the screen, you'll notice they say there's no better or more immediate evidence supporting the Darwinian theory than this process of forced transformation among our amicable germs. So according to them, this is the best they got. 3 things I want you to know about antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Number 1, the mutation that was responsible for antibiotic resistance did not arise as the result of the need of that organism. Let me explain that to you so that you understand it clearly. That means if I go out and I get in a car wreck this afternoon, and they send me to the hospital, and it's a bad wreck, and I wake up 3 days later, and I'm on IV antibiotics, and they come into the room and they say, Dr. Harrub, we're so sorry, but you have developed a resistant strain of bacteria. I didn't get those bacteria because the normal bacteria in my body mutated when I was giving the IV. What happened was they gave me an IV antibiotic, and it killed the normal bacteria, which then allowed the resistant strain that was present already in that hospital room to grow. I mean, if you want to know where multi-resistant bacteria hang out, guess where they like to be?
Hospitals.
The hospital. Number two, these resistant bacteria are not as virulent. They don't grow as quickly, which is hardly a recommendation for survival of the fittest. You know, if you're talking evolution here, guys, you want something that can reproduce quickly, that can grow fast, and yet these do not grow as quick. Finally, and most importantly, regardless of how the bacteria acquire their antibiotic resistance, they are still the same bacteria after receiving the trait as they were before. In other words, this is microevolution, not vertical macroevolution. All you've done is change the bacteria. You haven't gone from a bacteria to a dog or a cow or a horse or a giraffe. Now, guys, understand that's basically the best they've got right there. Let's look for just a second. Let's see. Yeah, let's look at this. Check out this quote. This is a professor of genetics at the University of Melbourne. He said, biologists are simply naive when they talk about experiments designed to test the theory of evolution. It is not testable. They may happen to stumble across facts which would seem to conflict with its predictions. These facts will invariably be ignored, and their discoverers will undoubtedly be deprived of continuing research grants. In other words, the system is set up to promote evolution. If you find out something that doesn't promote evolution, you're probably not going to get grant money. Dr. Etheridge, a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, he said 9/10 of the talk of evolutionists is sheer nonsense, not founded on observation, and wholly unsupported by the facts. Talking about the British Museum, he said, this museum is full of proofs of the utter falsity of their views. In all of this great museum, there is not one particle of evidence of the transmutation of species. I throw this in just because I think it's funny. Sharon Beagley said, so heated is the debate that one Darwinian says there are times when he thinks about going into the field with more intellectual honesty, the used car business. All right. Questions or comments thus far? Let me bring up a review page here.
Brad,
Yeah.
with regard to the viruses and bacteria, is the only reason that those antibiotic strains are allowed to produce is because the normal strains have been killed, and then once you're healed, the normal strains start to grow and they outlast or are better fitted for the environment than the antibiotic strains? Is that what you're saying?
Now, I'm saying that right now, if I go out and get in a wreck, I'm going to have, for instance, my body may be infected by Staph aureus. The normal type of staph. So I go to a hospital for them to patch me up. They give me antibiotics. The antibiotics is going to take care of the normal strain of Staph aureus.
Uh-huh.
But in my body's weakened immune system, the resistant strain that is on the hospital bed, that is on the thermometers they give you, the blood pressure cuff, that's on the pillows, that's in the instruments they use, that resistant strain is going to infect my body. And the antibiotics that they've been giving me are not going to do anything to knock it down.
Okay.
And it's not that the bacteria in my body mutated or evolved. It's simply they killed the normal bacteria, giving that antibiotic-resistant strain the opportunity to then grow. Guys, I want you to write down these 3 pillars because you may see them again. 3 things that evolution cannot explain. Number 1, they cannot explain how we got life from non-life. They cannot explain the very origin of matter, origin of the universe. Number 3, they cannot explain design found in nature. The point being, there is a model that can, and that would be called the creation model. Can evolution explain why human beings laugh or cry? I'm going to read these quickly, and then I'll take the computer off so I can see you guys. Can it explain the origin of sex and gender? Can it explain altruism or charity? Can it explain the origin of language or the origin of human consciousness? Guys, as you think about that list, the answer to every one of those is a resounding no. Why in the world, what benefit could you come up with of why human beings cry? Because think about it for just a moment. Your eyes blur up. You've got to produce tears, lacrimal glands. You're not in a good fight or flight defense mechanism if you're crying. That's not a good survival of the fittest mechanism. So why in the world would we evolve the ability to cry? Or how do you evolve love? You know, the other one that nobody ever talks about is sex and gender. How do you evolve a separate male and female? Now realize you've got to do it at the same place. So let's say you got a fish that comes out onto the land. Not only does he have to evolve, he got to talk his girlfriend into coming with him. I will share this with you, and I'll deny it later on if anybody asks. I was in West Virginia. I was doing a seminar, and after I finished, I opened it up for questions. This lady kept her mouth silent. She didn't say anything. But after I finished, an evolutionary biologist came running down the aisle, shaking her finger at me. I mean, she was absolutely just giving me all kinds of grief. And so you know how anytime something like that happens, members of the church, man, it's kind of like a fight in high school. Everybody starts crowding around. They want to see what's going on. She was talking so much, and she was so mad that I realized I was only going to get one shot at this lady. That I was only going to get to ask her one question. And so I put my hand up. I said, look, I will sit here all night and listen to everything you have to say and all of your evidence if you can answer one question for me. And she kind of calmed down. She said, okay, what? I looked at her. I said, okay, can you explain to me why you have a menstrual cycle and animals have an estrous cycle? Kid you not, guys, I literally watched the blood kind of left her face. Because you think about it for just a moment. In all reality, dogs, they go in heat twice a year. They are only sexually receptive twice a year. Human females should be receptive pretty much all the time. I won't be living that one down anytime soon. The point is, guys, they can't explain, how do you evolve a menstrual cycle? You know, it's a fact of nature, it happens, but they don't have an explanation for it. And so when push came to shove, this woman literally, she realized I had the goods. She literally just kind of bowed her head, turned around, and walked out of the church building. So which was one of the few times that the members of the church, like, started clapping, giving me a standing ovation for talking about menstrual cycles of all things. So, exactly, they're clapping in the church building. I was like, whoa.
Are they allowed to do that?
Under that particular instance, they were, yes.
Just kind of evolved.
What kind of questions or comments do you guys have regarding the whole concept of evolution and some of the hoaxes that we've looked at today? What I had hoped to do today was simply lay down a foundation. You know, there's really only two theories of origins. Number one, God created everything, or everything evolved. Now, you can be like Richard Dawkins and you can say, well, no, maybe everything came from a meteorite from outer space. Well, all you're doing there is you're simply moving the argument of origins to a different location. It still means either God created that life form on the meteorite, or it came from nothing.
Right.
What I wanted to do today is I wanted to lay a foundation that this other theory, the one that is legally taught in every state in our union, which, by the way, is the only legal theory that is taught in every state of the union, when you really start looking at it, it's horrible. It's got basically nothing to it. And yet that is the predominance of what young people are learning today. Other thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, sir.
I've actually heard human consciousness being described as simply subspeech. In my paper on psychology, the behaviorist just says that, you know, we everything that we think, it comes from another person, or it comes from experiences that we've had. It's not necessarily something that we get divinely. But someone posed a question that said, well, if everything that we get, if every thought that we have comes from something before us or someone beside us, then where does it all go back to?
Right, where's the original? Absolutely. There were some really cool studies that were done quite a while back by two neurologists who basically proved that there is a difference in brain matter and what we would call the mind. And basically what they were seeing was they were measuring literally somebody's intent or thought before their brain and their motor skills actually moved. It was a pretty telling research project. It was a project that basically disproved these folks who say, hey, you're nothing but a bunch of neurons that are firing. The word we use is dualism, where you've got a brain and a mind, or brain and a soul. You can imagine, evolutionists don't want you to have both. They want to be able to say, no, you're just a sack of neurons. But they did these studies proving that you've got both. So next week we will continue looking at some of the evolutionary errors. We will walk down some dinosaur paths and things like that. I will do my best, Paul, to address the turn it in thing. I'm not saying that I'm going to get it done tonight because I have a major important family meeting tonight. We're going through our vision for the year. But I will work really hard to get it done tomorrow. I'm actually in the office tomorrow, so that will give me a free day to get some things done. So I look forward to getting your test. I'll try to get them turned back to you guys within a week. You guys have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.